The HOA president screamed across the street. "You can't park 5 cars here. This isn't a used car lot." I smiled, leaned on the hood of my Corvette, and replied, "I'll make a note of that right after I raise your rent." When I moved into Maplewood Estates, I wasn't trying to start a war. I just wanted a quiet place to live with enough room for my cars, some privacy, and a bit of space to breathe. The neighborhood was clean and neat, the houses were modern without being flashy, and it had that calm suburban silence I needed after years of constant business travel. I didn't expect drama. I especially didn't expect it to arrive in the form of a red-lipped woman named Karen who ran the HOA like a queen guarding her castle. The trouble began just 3 weeks after I moved into the corner lot with the wide driveway. I had 5 cars, each one important to me. A black 1969 Camaro I'd restored with my father before he passed, a white F-150 work truck I used for projects, a silver Tesla I drove every day, a Jeep for weekend adventures, and my pride and joy, a candy apple red Corvette I drove maybe once or twice a month. Every one of them had its place to fit in the garage, 3 in the driveway. None were on the street. None were broken down or leaking oil. Still, it didn't take long before the HOA came knocking. Well, not knocking exactly. They taped a warning notice to my front door like a parking ticket. Bold red letters across the top. Excessive vehicle violation, immediate attention, required. I laughed out loud the first time I read it. Was this serious? I wasn't running a used car lot. I wasn't even the only person on the block with more than 1 car. The retired couple across the street had 3, and their grandkids' beat-up hatchback was almost always parked on the curb. But sure enough, right there in the letter, it said I had been reported for exceeding the reasonable limit of household vehicles visible from the street. I thought maybe it was a mistake. Maybe someone mixed up addresses, so I called the HOA office. A woman named Sandra answered, sounding board. When I explained the letter, she sighed and said, "You'll have to speak with the president directly." She made the complaint. I paused. "The president?" "Yes," Sandra said. "Mrs. Karen Templeton. She lives 2 houses down from you. The brick one with the large azalea bushes." I hung up and looked out the window. There she was. Short blonde hair, white sneakers, black yoga pants, and a clipboard tucked under her arm. She was standing in her driveway, glaring at my home like it personally offended her. I waved. She didn't wave back. Instead, she turned and walked inside like I was beneath her radar. The next day I walked over and knocked on her door. She opened it halfway, not even bothering to greet me. "Can I help you?" she asked sharply. I kept my tone polite. "I'm your neighbor Michael. I got a vehicle violation notice, and it said the HOA president filed it. I just wanted to clear up any misunderstanding." She folded her arms. "There's no misunderstanding. You only allowed a certain number of vehicles in view. It's in our HOA's community guidelines." I raised an eyebrow. I read the bylaws before I bought the house. It mentions commercial vehicles and abandoned cars, not personal ones parked on driveways. She narrowed her eyes. "We added that rule in a board meeting last year. It's in the updated handbook." "Well, I never got that." "Then to suggest you attend a meeting sometime." I knew then this wasn't about rules. This was about her power. Karen didn't like that I had nice cars. She didn't like that I didn't ask permission to move in, paint my mailbox, or line up for approval like the rest of her kingdom. I wasn't a troublemaker, but I also didn't bend to people like her. She had picked the wrong person to push. A few days later, I got another notice. This time it came with a fee, $75, due within 10 days. For non-compliance, if unpaid, the fee would compound monthly and be added to my property file. I shook my head in disbelief. The notice wasn't even signed by a board, just Karen herself. I called the number at the bottom. Sandra answered again. I asked to speak to someone besides the president. She said the HOA board was currently chaired solely by Mrs. Templeton until new elections next spring. So, let me get this straight. I thought Karen was the board. She made the rules, enforced them, and charged people as she saw fit. I sat down that evening and thought through my options. I could sell the house and move again, but I had just finished making it my home. I could pay the fine, remove a few cars, and keep my head down, but that wasn't my style either. Then I remembered something important. This wasn't my first property. In fact, Maplewood wasn't even my first investment on this street. Back in 2011, I had started buying up properties in this neighborhood when the housing market dipped. Some were short sales, some were foreclosures, others were just aging homes people wanted to offload. I bought them quietly through different LLCs, managed them as rentals, and kept them under the radar. I made sure they were maintained to HOA standards to avoid attention. I never flaunted ownership. But over the years, I had accumulated quite a few, and now, sitting at my dining table with Karen threatening me over cars, I realized I owned more of this neighborhood than she knew. I went to my safe and pulled out the file thick with deeds and paperwork for houses on Birch Lane, 2 on Pine Grove, 6 on this very cul-de-sac including mine. That was 7 out of the 16 homes here. With just over half the properties, I had majority influence on any HOA votes or petitions, whether Karen liked it or not. I didn't plan to. to use that information right away. No, I wanted to see how deep Karen was willing to dig her own hole. Over the next week, she ramped up her campaign. She sent another violation letter, this time for unapproved window tinting, followed by a warning about my non-uniform lawn edging. I couldn't help but laugh. The woman was now inventing infractions just to provoke me. One day, she even came by while I was working on my Jeep and said, "If you can't follow the rules, perhaps this isn't the right neighborhood for you." I wiped my hands on a rag and looked her straight in the eyes. "Actually, Karen, I think it's the perfect neighborhood." That night I called my real estate agent and told him I wanted the house at the end of the street, the one just listed for cash. I didn't care about the price. It was worth it just for the symbolism. If Karen wanted a game, I'd play it. But I'd play it with a full hand while she thought she was the dealer. By the time I was done, I wasn't just going to stop her nonsense. I was going to make sure she understood exactly who held the real power on this block. The wheels were in motion. Karen had no clue the man she was trying to find out of the neighborhood owned most of the properties she walked past every day. She didn't know her threats were aimed at her own landlord's front door. And she definitely didn't know that her little HOA empire was built on land I controlled more than she ever imagined. Let her send one more violation. I was ready. Karen didn't waste any time escalating her little war. Just 2 days after I bought the house at the end of the street, the last one, I needed to control a clear majority of the cul-de-sac. I received a notice accusing me of unauthorized business activity on the premises. This time, she claimed that the number of cars in my driveway suggested I was operating an auto repair shop out of my home. I almost laughed myself sick reading it. I imagined her peeking through her curtains with binoculars, scribbling on her clipboard like some kind of suburban spy. She had officially moved from annoying to ridiculous, but what she couldn't know was that her time was running out. I had already spoken to my attorney and had him start the process of forming a new homeowners association, a completely separate HOA that would include only the properties I owned or those with owners who agreed to break from Karen's group. I needed just one more house to hit the threshold, and that was the beauty of my quiet purchase at the end of the street. That property tipped the scale. With it, I could legally dissolve my participation in Karen's HOA and start my own. One that actually followed fair rules and didn't invent violations to feed someone's ego. Before doing anything formal, though, I took a walk around the block, quietly talking with my tenants. They were good people: teachers, a firefighter, a retired mechanic, a single mother with twins. Most had no idea that I was the owner of their homes. I liked it that way. I treated property like a long-term investment, not a badge of status. I kept rents, fair, maintenance up to date, and never raised fees without a reason. When I explained what Karen was doing to me and what I was planning in response, their reaction was almost unanimous about time. One woman, Mrs. Davis, a nurse who lived in one of the properties I'd owned for years, told me Karen once issued her a fine because her patio umbrella was the wrong shade of green. Another tenant said they were warned for using a plastic kiddie pool in the backyard during the summer. Karen had been overreaching for years, but people had been too busy, tired, or afraid to fight back. Now they had someone who could. I gathered signed letters from each of my tenants authorizing me to act on their behalf in HOA matters. I also reached out to the couple across the street who owned their home outright. I'd helped them shovel their driveway during the winter, and they were more than happy to sign on to my new HOA. That brought me to 10 homes, well above the majority needed. The legal filing took about 2 weeks, during which I kept a low profile. Karen, on the other hand, grew bolder by the day. She began sending letters not only to me but also to my tenants, threatening fines for things like barking dogs, non-regulation trash cans, and infrequent flower bed updates. She was drowning in her own thirst for control, and she didn't even notice the current shifting beneath her feet. When the approval came through from the city registrar, I held the stamped document in my hands like it was a trophy. The new Maplewood Crescent Homeowners Association was officially registered. With it, all homes under my ownership were no longer subject to Karen's HOA rules. I also made sure the paperwork included a statement requesting exemption from the original HOA's jurisdiction and its associated dues. It was entirely legal. In fact, the city clerk even said I wasn't the first person to take this route in response to an overzealous HOA. The following weekend, I hosted a neighborhood chat and chili in my front yard. I set up some tables, a few chairs, and made a big batch of chili in a cast iron pot on a propane burner. The smell alone drew people in. One by one, neighbors trickled over, some tenants, some owners, all curious. Even the couple who had moved in just 2 months ago came by with their toddler. Everyone had a story about Karen: how she fined someone's teenage son for parking too close to the curb, how she once knocked on the door at 7 a.m. because a porch light bulb had burned out overnight. People were fed up, but until now, they had felt powerless. I stood up after most people had gotten a bowl of chili and simply said, "I know many of you have had issues with the HOA, so have I. That's why I've formed a new one that's fair, clear, and doesn't treat neighbors like criminals." I handed out copies of the new bylaws. They were only 3 pages long. No vague language, no color codes, no nonsense. Just common sense rules. Keep your property safe and clean. Don't bother your neighbors. And be respectful. I didn't mention Karen's name once. I didn't need to, but of course, word traveled fast. The very next morning, I saw Karen pacing on her lawn, yelling into her phone. A few hours later, I received a hand-delivered letter from her, this time marked urgent. She claimed my new HOA was invalid, illegal, and in violation of the original community charter. I forwarded it to my attorney, who responded with a formal cease and desist letter explaining the legality of my new HOA and listing the statutes that protected it. That letter shut her down for the time being, but I knew Karen wasn't the type to go quietly. Sure enough, just a week later, Karen filed a complaint with the county zoning board accusing me of operating a corporate housing scheme. It was laughable. Every one of my tenants had proper leases, and the homes were single-family dwellings. I attended the hearing myself, armed with documents, leases, and inspection reports. The zoning officer looked mildly irritated that he even had to be there when Karen stood up to speak. She went into a rant about how Michael here has turned this peaceful neighborhood into a commercial venture. She waved around photos of my cars, my guests, even the chili cookout. I didn't say a word. I just handed over my packet. The zoning officer flipped through it and finally looked at her and said, "Ma'am, this is all legal. He's well within his rights. We're done here." Karen stormed out, fuming. Back at home, I noticed a change in the air. The neighbors were more relaxed. Kids played outside without being scolded for too much noise. One woman even painted her front door a bright teal, something Karen never would have allowed. The entire block felt lighter, freer. Karen, meanwhile, seemed to retreat into her home more often. Her daily patrols stopped, her clipped notes and angry letters dried up. But then came the move that truly sealed everything. Karen had been living in that house for over 20 years, but recently she'd fallen behind on her HOA legal expenses. To fund her battles, especially after losing the zoning case, he'd taken out a loan against her home. What she didn't realize was that she'd sold a percentage of her mortgage note to a small investment group to raise cash fast. That group, it was me, or more accurately, one of my LLCs. The irony was delicious. All that time she spent trying to control the neighborhood. And she hadn't even realized she was handing power over piece by piece, through a legitimate transaction handled by my attorney and masked under a corporate name. I now had partial ownership of the very house Karen lived in. She wouldn't find out right away, but she would. For now, I let her live in the illusion that she still had control. I didn't spike the football. I didn't gloat. I just watched her cling to what little authority she thought she had left, while the neighborhood slowly became what it should have always been, neighborly. I wasn't done yet. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in weeks, I sat on my front porch with a glass of tea and watched the sun go down without a warning taped to my door. The war wasn't over, but it was no longer a fair fight. Karen had brought a clipboard to a chess match, and I was already 10 moves ahead. 2 weeks passed with barely a whisper from Karen. No letters, no new violations, not even her usual angry glare from behind the blinds. The neighborhood was adjusting quickly to its new rhythm, one without constant surveillance. Children were riding bikes again. Neighbors waved to each other without suspicion. Even the elderly couple with the noisy wind chimes stopped muting them when Karen was walking by. It was starting to feel like an actual community. And for the first time since I moved in, I could breathe without bracing for a new fabricated citatio, and I knew better than to assume silence meant surrender. Though Karen wasn't the type to simply accept defeat, especially not when her illusion of control had been so publicly shattered. It was more likely she was regrouping, digging through HOA documents, trying to find some legal backdoor to reclaim her crown. My guess wasn't far off. One evening, just after sunset, a white SUV pulled up outside my driveway. 2 men in buttoned-up polos and khakis stepped out and approached my porch. They introduced themselves as compliance officers contracted by the HOA for neighborhood inspections. Not mine, of course, Karen's HOA. I politely asked for identification. They hesitated, fumbling with their clipboards. I didn't let them get far. "This property," I said calmly, "is no longer under the jurisdiction of Maplewood Estates Homeowners Association. It's part of the newly registered Maplewood Crescent HOA. You're trespassing." One of them tried to argue, waving a printed copy of the original HOA charter. I smiled and handed him a certified city approval letter, complete with my attorney's signature. "Unless you want to explain to the city clerk why you're enforcing policies on properties no longer under your governance, I suggest you step off this lot." They left after some grumbling. I watched them drive a slow circle around the block, probably checking off some imaginary list of offenses, but their reaction told me everything I needed to know. Karen was making one last push. The next day, I received a call from my property manager. One of the tenants in a rental I owned, house number 12, had reported receiving a strongly worded letter taped to their front door. It wasn't signed by Karen this time. It came from the Emergency Interim Committee of Maplewood Estates HOA, a name that sounded official but meant absolutely nothing. It threatened eviction from the neighborhood due to non-compliance with community unity protocols. That was a new one. Karen hadn't used that phrase before. I drove to house number 12 and met with the tenant, a young couple expecting their first child. They were understandably anxious. They'd never dealt with HOA drama before and feared their lease might be affected. I assured them nothing was going to happen and showed them their copy of the letter from my HOA declaring their exemption from the old one's rules. I made a few calls, confirmed none of the so-called interim committee members were legitimate board members, and reported the fake notice to the county. But Karen wasn't just handing out threats anymore, she had gotten sneakier. 3 days later, one of my other tenants, an older veteran named Hank, called me and said someone claiming to be from Neighborhood Beautification Services had come by and told him his backyard grill setup was in violation of open flame safety regulations. I knew immediately it was bogus. Hank's backyard was spotless better than mine. In fact, Handa's grill was on a stone patio 10 feet from anything flammable. But Karen, or one of her new little minions, was clearly sending people out under fake titles to scare folks back into submission. That night, I sent out a notice to all of my tenants and the homeowners who had joined my HOA. I encouraged them to report any unverified contact attempts, record conversations when possible, and contact me immediately if they felt pressured or threatened. I also installed security cameras around my own property and at the entrances to a few of my rentals. A few days after that, I caught something on video that made my blood boil. Karen herself sneaking through my side yard at 6:42 in the morning, clipboard in hand. She crouched behind my garbage bins, took a few photos of my driveway and back porch, and then vanished down the sidewalk like some amateur spy. She looked ridiculous: sweatpants, slippers, and that ever-present sense of smug superiority. I saved the footage and sent it straight to my attorney, who filed a formal cease and desist for harassment and trespassing. I could have pressed charges, but I didn't. Not yet. I had something better in mind. You see, Karen's home, technically still her residence, was no longer entirely hers. Months ago, when she scrambled to cover legal costs, she sold off part of her equity to a private group, and that group, quietly managed by one of my companies, now held a controlling interest in her mortgage note. That meant I had some say in how her property was managed, and more importantly, I had access to the fine print. After reviewing her mortgage details, my legal team found a clause that allowed us to request a property inspection on behalf of the lender. If the property was found to be in violation of any safety, structural, or maintenance standards, the lender could impose additional requirements or, in extreme cases, force a reassessment of the mortgage terms. The house had to be maintained in model condition, and based on what I'd seen, Karen had some explaining to do. I sent a team of inspectors, real ones, licensed, insured, and carrying clipboards for all the right reasons. They found a host of issues: cracked foundation in one corner, outdated wiring in her garage, a termite situation starting to brew in her attic. Nothing dangerous yet, but enough to flag concern. A formal report was issued and passed to the lender. A letter followed. Karen was instructed to complete the repairs within 30 days, or face a possible escalation to foreclosure review. This wasn't revenge. This was just business. The very same kind she had tried to manipulate to control everyone around her. Word got out quickly. The neighborhood grapevine was alive again, but this time it wasn't fear, it was relief. Karen's power was dissolving, and the community was waking up. People began repainting their mailboxes whatever color they liked. Front porch swings, when Aplon gnomes made their return. Even the local teenager who had once been fined for playing music in his garage band got a second shot. He performed a small acoustic concert in my front yard one evening. We called it Freedom Friday. Karen, meanwhile, withdrew into her house almost completely. I rarely saw her anymore. Her once pristine flower beds began to wilt. Her hedge, trimmed like clockwork every Saturday, started growing wild. It was like watching a statue crack and crumble in real time. Then one morning, I received a letter, not a violation this time, but a formal request. It was from Karen. Handwritten, shaky cursive. She asked to meet. Out of curiosity more than anything, I agreed. We sat on opposite sides of a weathered picnic table near the community playground. She looked tired, smaller somehow. The clipboard was gone. "I just wanted to ask," she said quietly, "if you're planning to buy me out completely." I was honest. "If it comes to that, yes. I have no interest in forcing you out, Karen, but you've made things very difficult for a lot of good people." She looked down at her hands. "I thought I was keeping things in order, keeping standards. Maybe at first," I said, "but somewhere along the way you stopped serving the community and started ruling it. That's not the same thing." She nodded, said nothing for a while, then quietly stood and walked away. As I watched her disappear between the houses, I realized something important. Karen wasn't just a bully, she was someone who had built her entire identity around a flimsy title, and now that title meant nothing. Her clipboard had been her crown, her warning letters, her sword. Now she had no kingdom left, but I did. The weeks after my meeting with Karen were eerily quiet, too quiet. I half expected some kind of last gasp effort, a desperate legal maneuver, an anonymous complaint, or even one of those fake inspection notices taped to a door. But none came. Her house stayed dark most evenings. Her driveway, once obsessively swept and power washed, was now coated with a thin layer of leaves and pine needles. The woman who once ticketed a neighbor for hanging wind chimes had now fallen completely off the map. I wasn't naive enough to think it was over, but the silence gave the neighborhood room to breathe. My tenants started hosting small weekend barbecues. Kids drew chalk art on sidewalks. The couple with the loud parrot on Birch Lane didn't receive a single complaint. For the first time since I moved into Maplewood Estates, the neighborhood actually felt like home. Still, I knew I had unfinished business. While Karen was losing her grip on the neighborhood, she still legally owned her home, well, part of it. The remaining equity she hadn't sold off was barely enough to keep her name on the deed, and after the inspection report I submitted to the lender, her grace period for repairs was winding down fast. I didn't enjoy pushing people to the edge, but Karen had used her position to make other people miserable for years. The list of neighbors she'd fined, threatened, or intimidated was longer than the HOA's outdated bylaws. Now she had to be held to the same rules she loved to wield against others, but the 30-day repair deadline looming. I sent one of my project managers to her property. We didn't knock, we didn't cause a scene, we simply documented the state of the home, cracks still visible on the side foundation, rotting wood beneath the roofline, and clear signs of water damage on the upper windows. It was more than enough. A week later, the mortgage servicing group controlled by my company issued a formal notice of default. Karen was given 10 days to arrange financing for the repairs, or the group would initiate foreclosure proceedings under the shared ownership clause she had signed months ago. It was official. The house she'd ruled from for 2 decades was now hanging by a thread. That's when something unexpected happened. One night, around 10 p.m., I was locking up my garage when I noticed a small sedan parked across the street with its lights off. It wasn't a neighbor's car. I watched from my porch, quiet and still. A few minutes later, a shadow moved between houses, someone walking quickly, like they didn't want to be seen. I stepped back and waited. The next morning, 3 of my tenants reported that someone had placed flyers on their doors during the night. They were printed in all caps, bold red letters across the top. New HOA leadership coming. Don't be fooled by corporate takeover. The flyer accused me of manipulating the neighborhood for personal gain, claimed I was erasing the community's culture, and even accused me of illegally purchasing influence. There was no signature, no HOA letterhead, just a phone number and a slogan: "Take back our block." The number was a burner. I had it traced, a prepaid phone registered to no one, but we all knew who it was. Karen was back. What she didn't realize was how much had changed in her absence. No one believed the flyer. My tenants tossed them in the trash without a second thought. The homeowners who had joined my new HOA laughed it off. Even the elderly couple who used to support Karen now sent me a text: "We remember when she tried to fine us for planting wildflowers. Good luck dealing with that nonsense." Still, it irritated me. Not because the flyer would do damage, it wouldn't, but because it meant she wasn't learning. She wasn't growing. She was still stuck in that same self-righteous bubble, convinced that authority was something to be clutched rather than earned, so I paid her a visit. It was late afternoon. Her yard was overgrown, and several shutters on the second floor were hanging crooked. I knocked, no answer. I knocked again, more firmly. After a minute, the door opened just enough for her face to peek through. She looked worse than before, unkempt, bitter. "What do you want?" she asked flatly. "Just to talk." She hesitated, then stepped aside and let me in. The inside of her home was almost the same, neat but faded. The once immaculate decor was showing signs of neglect: dust along the mantel, unwashed mugs in the sink, mail piled on the side table. We sat in her living room, across from each other like old rivals in a forgotten duel. "You know this isn't going to work," I said. "The flyers, the fear-mongering people aren't buying it anymore." She didn't respond. "Karen," I continued, "you could have built something here, something real. But instead, you treated people like pawns in a game only you were playing." Still nothing. Just a blank stare. I leaned forward. "This house, your house, is in default. I don't want to force you out. But if you keep pushing this lie, I won't stop what's already in motion. You sold too much control too quickly. You gave up your leverage months ago." Her lip quivered, just slightly. "You ruined everything." I shook my head. "No, you did. I just stopped you from ruining anyone else." I stood to leave. As I reached the door, she called out, "So what now? You just take everything?" I turned. "No, Karen, I give it back to the people you took it from." I left her in silence. 2 weeks later, a for sale sign went up in her yard. The house was cleaned up just enough for photos, but the damage was obvious to anyone who looked closely. I didn't make an offer. I didn't need to. A young family bought it: a teacher, her husband, and their daughter. They joined our new HOA within days. With Karen gone, the transition was seamless. Her old HOA officially disbanded due to lack of quorum. The city closed their filing, and the legal ownership of her administrative materials was transferred to us by default. Everything she had built, every spreadsheet, folder, violation notice, was now in a box in my garage. I never opened it. Instead, I focused on what came next. I worked with the new HOA to plan a summer block party. Nothing extravagant, just food, music, and neighbors coming together without rules hanging over their heads. We grilled hot dogs, kids ran around with sparklers, a small band played classic rock. For the first time since I bought that corner lot, I felt like part of something bigger than myself. One of the neighbors raised a toast halfway through the evening to new beginnings, she said, and to the guy who saved the block. I smiled, raised my glass, but said nothing. I didn't do this for praise. I did it because people like Karen don't stop unless someone stands up, and I had stood up for all of us. The sun was just beginning to rise over Maplewood Crescent as I stepped out onto my porch, coffee in hand, and looked across the street. For the first time since I'd moved here, the cul-de-sac looked exactly as I'd always imagined it would, peaceful, lived in, and free from Karen's dictatorship. The newly moved-in family had already planted a flower bed where Karen's rigid hedges used to be. The air smelled like fresh soil and barbecue charcoal from the night before. There were no warning notices taped to doors, no clipboard-wielding patrols, just neighbors being neighbors. A soft breeze rustled the wind chimes that Karen once tried to have removed from a veteran's porch. Now, they rang freely like a quiet victory bell. The final closing on Karen's house had gone through just 5 days earlier. She never said goodbye to anyone. She didn't host a farewell, didn't post a notice, she just vanished. A moving truck came early in the morning, loaded her life piece by piece, and drove away without a word. The woman who once ruled the block like a queen left like a ghost. I heard through the grapevine she moved into a rental apartment 2 towns over, a place with no HOA. The irony was sharp. What surprised me most wasn't that she left quietly, but how fast the neighborhood bounced back. Without her constant meddling, people began forming real connections. The front porches that used to sit empty were now decorated with plants, flags, and welcome mats. One neighbor even turned their garage into a makeshift art studio and started giving painting lessons to kids on Saturday mornings. The power vacuum Karen left wasn't filled by anyone trying to be a new boss. Instead, it was filled by collaboration. Our new HOA wasn't perfect, but it was transparent, democratic, and focused on keeping the neighborhood safe and functional without intruding on anyone's personal life. We even set up a simple online portal for community votes and suggestions. No clipboard, no yelling, just progress still. Part of me felt unfinished, like I had one last thing to do to close this chapter for good. I opened the old cardboard box marked HOA Karen Templeton, which had been sitting untouched in my garage for weeks. Inside were dozens of files, photos of people's properties, handwritten complaints, maps of shrub layouts, and page after page of ridiculous infractions. It was like walking into a museum of paranoia. One folder was labeled enforcement priority. I opened it and found a list of names with little sticky notes next to them. Watch lawn height. Check flagpole angle. Unapproved wreath. Next to my name, she had written, owns too many cars. Possible flipper. Investigate. It was almost comical how deep her obsession had gone. I flipped through the folder one last time, then dropped the entire box into my outdoor fire pit. I lit a match, watched the flames catch the corners of those brittle papers, and felt the tension finally leave my shoulders. Karen's rule was gone, and I didn't need to keep a single reminder of it. The community was no longer haunted by her name. Later that evening, we held our first official HOA election. No drama, no angry speeches, just neighbors gathering at the park's picnic tables, sipping iced tea, and nominating people who genuinely cared. The firefighter's wife volunteered to manage the online system. Mrs. Davis, the nurse who Karen once tried to find for a patio umbrella, became our new chair. I was nominated too, but I turned it down. I'd done my part. Now it was someone else's turn to lead, not rule. After the votes were tallied and the new leadership announced, I slipped away from the group for a few minutes and walked back toward my house. The streetlights flickered on, casting a soft orange glow over the quiet street. I passed house number 12, where the young couple had just welcomed a baby girl. Past Hank's house's grill fired up again, sending out the smell of smoked ribs. Past the spot where Karen once snapped photos of me behind trash bins. Now it was just an empty curb. When I reached my front porch, I sat down and looked out over the homes I owned and the ones I didn't, the ones I didn't think, ones I'd protected anyway. Not through threats, but through understanding, through patience, through knowing when to fight and when to step back. I wasn't just a landlord here anymore. I was part of the neighborhood. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail, not a complaint, not a fine, just a card. Inside, a handwritten note from a teenager on the block whose dad had once been threatened by Karen for having a drum set in the garage. It read, "Thanks for giving us the freedom to live again. I never thought I'd get to play my music without someone calling it noise. Now, every beat feels like home." That one hit different because that's what it had all come down to in the end, not cars, or driveways, or bylaws, but home. The right to live in peace. The right to choose what kind of garden to grow. The right to hang wind chimes or paint your door purple or teach your daughter how to ride a bike without worrying someone would fine you for parking too close to the curb. Karen had mistaken rules for leadership, control for care. She didn't Understand that true community isn't built by making everyone the same. It's built by respecting the differences and trusting that people want to do right by each other. The last thing I did that month was update the welcome packet we gave 2 new residents. It didn't contain warnings or lists of approved paint colors. It simply said, "Welcome to Maplewood Crescent. Be kind, be fair, be neighborly." That was enough. And as I watched another day end in peace, I knew one thing for sure: the HOA war was over, and the neighborhood had finally won. If you enjoyed this story and want more real-life inspired neighborhood justice, don't forget to like, share, comment, and subscribe to Bright Reality on YouTube. Your support helps us keep the stories real, bold, and brighter than ever.